Hello, my name is Frank Perini and welcome to the third video on Microsoft Project Training. Today we'll be building on the last lesson, so if you haven't had a chance to already walk through those first two courses, please do so. It'll prepare you for today. Today we're going to be building right off of the file that we finished with in the last video, which I have open here. I'm going to go ahead and save this actually as a new file so that I can provide these at the end of the videos, and you can do the same if you'd like to. So in the last video we started talking about tasks, predecessors, which you can see we have here. So just as a quick reminder or refresh, we had this really high level WBS, work breakdown structure, that we created, and for each of these tasks we created a link to a predecessor, and I'll double click on the first one, Kickoff Meeting. And if you remember, all of our tasks are linked by a finish to start relationship. So today we're going to talk more about the other types of relationships and constraints that can be put on tasks that can maybe make your project a little more accurate. But before we do that, let's look at the kickoff meeting and let's think about if our current project plan makes 100% sense. So we have a charter approval, which again, just as a reminder, that's the official start date of the project. That's when we're considering this project started. And in my project information, I have the start date is January 1st. Well, because I have everything as auto-scheduled task, which is really the best practice, Microsoft Project has automatically put my kickoff meeting date on January 1st of 2021, which is basically the start of the project. It does that because it wants to schedule all these tasks to start as early as possible. Well, that might not really make sense. My kickoff, you'd be very lucky if your kickoff meeting could be completed on the exact day you planned to start the project. So you'd have a couple of options. One option would be to change the project start date to match the kickoff meeting. That's one way you could do this. And if let's say our kickoff meeting was actually on January 5th, a Tuesday, and I hit OK, well, now it's moved all that. But the problem with that is now it looks like my charter approval was on January 5th. And if you remember, I really like to document the charter approval because it really helps us accurately determine when did a program start, when did a project finish, how did we track with the timing. It's good for baselining. So it's not good to kind of, hack the data to get the result you want. So let's undo that. But that's one way you could do it to adjust the project dates, but it's probably not the best way to do it. Another way to do it would be to, of course, let's make this manually scheduled, okay? And let's make it Tuesday the 5th. And as you can see, now it's that greenish, tealish color, and it's moved all the other tasks accordingly. If you remember, project gives me an alert with these grayed out boxes saying, hey, the change you just made affected all this other data. But there's still a problem with that. What's the problem? Again, this could work, but it's probably not the best way to do it. Let's look at an example. Let's say that my project was scheduled to start on January 1st of 2021, and we've delayed the project to February 1st of 2021. Let's look at what happens when I do that. Okay, first I get a little warning from the planning wizard. It says you moved task 8 of video3.mpp to start January 27th. This is before the start of the project. Okay. It says I can do two things. It says I have some activities, tasks that are now scheduled to happen before the start of the project. And it says you can either continue and you can do that change and have tasks that start before the project date or cancel, don't do it. And then you can turn off this warning. I leave this warning on even though I'm relatively experienced with the software, because I always like to know when I have a mistake like this. Usually, if I have a task scheduled before the start of the project, it indicates that there's a mistake. Either I've made a typo or I've set up a constraint the wrong way. So I like to get this warning. And I suggest you don't turn this warning off unless you're really confident and that you're not going to make any mistakes. So let's hit continue and see what happens to this Gantt chart. So you can see what's happened is our charter date, which is tied to basically the project start date, it's an auto-scheduled task, that moved to February 1st, like it should have. That's the charter, that's the official new start date of the project. But because I had Kickoff Meeting set as a manually scheduled task, it's still January 1st. And it creates this plan that's actually not correct. It's either not correct because we're not going to start the project till February, or it's not correct because I have the wrong start date and we're actually doing work earlier than we said we're going to do. Either way, this really isn't a best practice. A best practice would be to have the start date of your project match the actual start date of the project, the actual day you start work. So let's undo that. Okay, so we're back to where we were before. So instead of a manually scheduled task, we're going to look at setting up a constraint for this, but still keeping it auto-scheduled. So let's double-click the Kickoff Meeting and open up the task information window. And you can see we still have our predecessor. You might have the general tab open, so click on predecessors, and you can see that the predecessor to this task is the charter approval, and it has a finish to start. So one way to do this would be a better way, probably one of the best ways to do this would be to set up a lag. So what is lag? Well, lag is just a time that you want to add. You want to add an extra delay between this finish to start relationship. So instead of the charter being finished and then instantly this next task starts, you may set up a lag of 1 week to say, after we get the charter approved, I'm going to have 1 week to set up and get all the people together for a kickoff meeting, or it could be 1 month. You can choose whatever lag you want. So in this case, let's just say I have a lag of 1 week. So I could do 1W, which is short for week, hit enter. Okay. And then watch the Gantt chart as I make this change when I hit OK. You can see that my schedule has shifted to the right. I still have that constraint, but I have a 1 week lag built in as a constraint. Okay? And also, you can see the predecessors, the text has changed. Instead of just saying 1, which is by default finish to start, which is also what this 1FS stands for, by the way, 1 finish to start, it says 1FS plus 1 week. So it's a finish to start relationship to task number 1, which is the charter, plus an extra week. And we could change that if we wanted to. If I wanted to type in here, I could even change that to 2 weeks and hit enter. And you can see now it has a 2 week lag from that first task finishing. Okay, so that's a better way. And the reason that's a little bit better is when I go to my project, and if I wanted to move this project to a month later to February 1st and hit OK, everything still works. Everything still makes sense. It didn't get broken. It's very easy to break projects, if you will, by setting up constraints that don't make sense or that are not automatically calculated in the right way. If you force the wrong constraint into the project plan like we did before with manually scheduled, by forcing that manually scheduled into the project plan, project will do what you ask it to do, but it doesn't yield a result that's really a best practice. It doesn't really make sense. So that's why it's really important to understand these constraints. Okay, so let's undo that. So By adding the lag, that's probably a good way to protect your project plan from like a future delay. So if it's possible that this start date changes, probably setting a 1 week lag again, that's probably one of the best ways to do that. That way I still have a constraint, but maybe I have a more reasonable time difference between those tasks, not just an instant finish to start. Some tasks you will want an instant finish to start, but this is probably not one of them. So another constraint we could put on the kickoff meeting is we could have a start no earlier than constraint. So I'll click on that, and I'll click on the Advanced tab. So if you're on the General tab, click on the Advanced tab. And you can see in the Advanced tab, there's a Constraint Type. And by default, tasks are set to start as soon as possible, which we've talked about a few times. But we can also see that there's a bunch of other constraints that we could apply to a task. We could want to do something as late as possible. This is not something you're going to do a lot of, but it is possible to have tasks that you want to do as late as possible. Good examples of that are typically things to control cash flow on your project. If something costs money, for example, an investment in tooling, well, you might want to do that as late as possible to improve the cash flow on your project, as long as it doesn't negatively affect your project schedule or goals. But that's an example of something you might want to do as late as possible. But a commonly used constraint is something like start no earlier than. So when would I use a start no earlier than constraint? Well, let's go back, let's cancel. I already have a constraint that says this charter approval the kickoff meeting must happen after the charter approval. And I have a 1 week lag in there. So the lag was kind of a guess maybe before. The lag might have been a guess earlier when I was setting up this project plan, because I didn't really know when I could schedule the meeting. But I knew it wasn't going to happen the very minute the charter was signed. So I might delete that. Sorry, I still want to keep my constraint. I just want to have a 0-day lag. So I still have the relationship between the two now, but I got rid of the lag, because now maybe I can actually plan for a specific day for this task. So this is where we would set up a start no earlier than. Now there's two ways to do that. One is to actually go into the Advanced menu and change the constraint type to start no earlier than, and we can pick the date. So maybe our customer said, hey, we can't meet with you for this kickoff meeting until maybe January the 15th. January 15th, 2021. And I hit OK. So when I do that, what happens is I still have the relationship between these tasks, meaning if the charter is not done, I still can't start this task. But I have another relationship, and you can see in this info column here, there's actually a new icon that we haven't seen before. This is warning me that this task has a start no earlier than constraint. And it warns you that because it wants you to know that there's an extra constraint on this that you might not be aware of that's controlling the schedule. If you didn't see this, you might keep telling yourself, why can't I get this thing to schedule earlier? It should start on January 1st. Why isn't it doing it? It's because it has another constraint. Okay? Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because if you think about it, we've maintained the linkage between these two tasks, which means if charter approval hasn't finished, kickoff meeting can't happen. So that's good. We still have our linkage. I still have the date. I'm still controlling the date that this task should actually happen on, which is what the customer has informed me of. Let's say the 15th, which is what we said, starting earlier than the 15th. That's good. And I still have it auto-scheduled, which is good. So this is really the best practice. I've maintained all the linkages. Project is still managing this activity for me. It's not being manually scheduled. It's being automatically scheduled by project. And I also have the right constraints that make sense. So the reason this is nice is even if the project got delayed, again, let's say the project got delayed to February 1st, you can see it still maintains the linkage. Now, this could make sense actually. The February 1st date might make sense if the customer says, hey, we're not gonna have the kickoff meeting till sometime in February. Well, you can see by changing this charter date to February 1st, it automatically drove all the schedule because I still had that linkage. And the only thing I might want to do in that case is I might want to go in here and add lag again, right? Maybe I add 1 week of lag. But that's part of project management, right? You have to kind of keep this file updated with the latest information, but you can see how we haven't broken the file. Nothing we've done has broken the file. And if you compare that with at the very beginning when we were overriding project or not using the auto scheduling, we can actually end up with a project file where tasks are starting earlier than it's possible and the project schedule doesn't make any sense. And that's how you end up with project schedules that don't make sense. On paper, project is telling you, oh, this would be done by June, but in reality, you're not going to be done till August, let's say, because your project file has been broken. Your constraints have over-constrained your schedules so that you're doing things when it's impossible. The information is no longer useful. So that's why it's so important to follow best practices and not just start manually moving things around and forcing things into constraints that could possibly hurt you in the future. Okay, so I'll tell you what, let's to make this clean, let's undo everything that we did here because we've got all these constraints baked in. Let's go back to the very beginning. So again, as a best practice, in this case, if we're starting this project charter on January 1st, for me, that's about a month and a half away from today. So I probably wouldn't have scheduled the exact kickoff meeting yet at that time. What's gonna make the most sense at this point in the project is to set a 1 week lag, right? And just say, we're probably gonna need about a week to do this kickoff meeting. And that will drive the expectations of the rest of the schedule accordingly, okay? So let's look at other types of constraints. So we've talked about finish to start. Let's look at other types of constraints related to linking tasks and predecessors. So we've already talked about finish to start a lot. I'm sure you're very comfortable with that. So let's look at the other ones and let's talk about where they might make sense. So let's look at design engineering. We have 2D drawings and 3D modeling. Now, in my experience, you got to have at least some 3D models of your product done before you can start doing your 2D drawings typically. But it wouldn't make sense to for most projects, it wouldn't make sense to say, let's get all the 3D modeling done. Let's not start any of the 2D drawings till all the 3D modeling's done. Let's not start any of the manufacturing specifications till everything else is done. That doesn't really make sense. So we probably don't want to say, we're going to finish 3D modeling, then we're going to start 2D drawings, then we're going to start manufacturing specifications. And if you think about that, by doing those just in series like that, instead of in any sort of overlapping parallel activities, you end up with, a couple months of time in your schedule, which maybe aren't really necessary if you could start doing some of that work in parallel. So let's double click 2D drawings. And instead of saying we want to finish 3D modeling to start 2D drawings, what might make more sense is to have what's called a start-to-start relationship. So what start-to-start relationship means is when I start 2D modeling, now I can start doing 2D drawings. Now they're probably not going to be exactly at the same percent complete at the same time, but it just means that those two types of work can be done in parallel. Now I can't do 2D drawings if I haven't started modeling because I won't have anything to draw. I don't have any model. But on the other hand, I don't need to wait till the modeling is 100% done to start. So I would hit maybe start to start and hit OK. And you can see my project schedule has changed now. So instead of this arrow kind of coming down and pointing straight on the top, you can see my Gantt chart has updated, and now these two tasks are going to happen in parallel. Okay, so you might have noticed that there's a problem with what we've just done, with what I've just described. We have 3D modeling, we have 2D drawings, okay? But if you look at the Gantt chart, our 3D modeling takes maybe a month, and we have about 2 weeks duration for 2D drawings. This duration might not be correct. But instead of thinking of it as these tasks being in parallel and this task can now finish, really the 2D drawings, that shouldn't be able to be finished until the 3D modeling is complete. Because once the 3D modeling is complete, now I can go ahead and finish up my 2D drawings. If I do all my 2D drawings and finish them, if I finish all of my drawings and release all of my engineering drawings before I've finished actually designing the product, well, those drawings can't be right. They're going to have to be updated. So this actually probably doesn't have a start-to-start relationship. It might have another type of relationship, which is called finish-to-finish. What finish-to-finish means is instead of a task finishing and then you starting another task, or instead of a task starting and you start another task and do them in parallel, finish-to-finish means you do them in parallel, but this task can't finish until this task is finished. So you can do lots of work on this task, like creating drawings. We can create a lot of drawings and start preparing all the documentation, but that can't be completed. We can't call that complete until the design work is done, the 3D modeling is done. Otherwise, we can't be sure that our drawings are complete. So these probably have a finish-to-finish relationship. Once I've finished all of my 3D modeling, I've finished all of my design work, now I can finish my 2D drawing package. So let's change that to a finish-to-finish relationship. And let's see what happens with the Gantt chart. Okay, that looks better. So you can see what's happened here is the arrow, which was on this side, has now jumped to this side, and it says this finish triggers that finish. And these activities still happen in parallel, but instead of 2D drawings happening at the front end and finishing and driving the next task earlier, they still happen in parallel, but 2D drawings finishes at the same time as 3D modeling, which pushes back the rest of the activities to a more reasonable date. So that's our finish-to-finish constraint. And you can see under predecessors now, where we had an FS for finish to start, which is the default for the rest of these, we now have 8FF, means task 8, finish to finish relationship. Okay? And then let's look at the last type of constraint. Let's just apply it to this last one. So the last type that we haven't talked about yet is called start to finish. So this is a little bit of an unusual one. It's not real common compared with the others, but it still has its place. Start to finish means when the other task starts, then this task can finish. So what would be an example of that? Well, let's say your project has security. Let's say that there's a security guard who's watching your facility or whatever. That the start of the next security guard's shift. This is kind of like shift work. When the new security guard shows up and he starts and he clocks in and he's ready, then the other security guard can finish. The first security guard on duty, him finishing, is totally dependent on the next task starting, if that makes any sense. Otherwise, if it wasn't, otherwise you would have a gap in security. So that's kind of a start to finish relationship, which means the start of one task, which would be the start of security guard 2 showing up, triggers the finish of security guard 1. So that's kind of a start to finish relationship. And let's look at how that would affect the project. In this case, it doesn't make any sense, but I just want to show you what it would look like. So you can see our 2D drawings, the start of that project, this arrow comes around and points to the finish of manufacturing specifications. So the start of 2D drawings triggers the finish of manufacturing specifications in this plan, which doesn't make sense. It's not common in this type of a project, but from an example perspective, again, think of you have 2 employees, and the start of the second employee will trigger the finish of the first. So it's kind of like that's when a start would trigger a finish. It's relatively uncommon for a lot of projects. So, but I want you to be aware of that and what that means. Okay. So we've already talked about a start no earlier than. Let's see if there's also finish no earlier than. So we have build prototype. So let's just come up with another theoretical example of where this might make sense. So build prototype. Now we haven't talked about cost, we haven't talked about material, but let's just say your CFO says, hey, I don't want to build these prototypes until July because that's when our fiscal year starts. We can't spend any money. So even if your schedule says, let's start building, on this date, we're not going to be able to spend any money on the prototype material. So, in an example like that, maybe to finish, maybe after your prototyping, there's an investment. So let's just insert a row here. After test prototype, sorry. Let's insert a row. Let's call this maybe, like tooling investment. Okay. And by the way, I want to also mention one more thing. I always set this is a little box down here that you can click on, and when you create a new task, it will determine by default, is that auto-scheduled or manually scheduled. Microsoft Project, by default, will set everything to manually scheduled. I usually set this to auto-scheduled, but I wanted to show that. So now when I create a new task, so if I delete that, if I were to insert that task now, and let's call this tooling investment. You see that's a auto-scheduled task by default, which I prefer. That way I don't accidentally have manual tasks in my plan, but it's up to you what makes the most sense for you. So let's say that my tooling investment after my prototype, let's adjust these. So after my prototype, now I can invest in tooling. Okay, and let's make that a milestone. Let's just say that that's a milestone where we're going to invest in our formal tooling. Okay, and then maybe launch. Maybe after tooling, we have a 1 month lag. So, after we've invested in tooling, we have 1 month to set up. Maybe that's how that would make sense, just for this example. And I'll save this. So you can see now we have this relationship where we have a tooling investment. So your CFO comes to you and says, we can't do this tooling investment until, a couple months later because of cash flow reasons and financial reasons and fiscal year and quarters and things like that. So instead of just changing the start date, just be aware we can also change the finish date. So let's say he says, September 1st is the day where, we would be able to spend the money. Well, you can see I have this constraint here. This task has a finish no earlier than constraint, which means it doesn't matter when this task could start. And you can see the start date's changed because the duration's 0. Even though this task could have started earlier, it's set to start later now. And the reason is this task has a finish no earlier than constraint. Okay, let's undo that. So you can see now I have 6:15, 6:15. I could do the same with the start, so September 1st, but I get this I get this error. So I got this error for the start date. I didn't get it for the finish date. Let's just look at that, and then we'll look at this error in detail. Oops. So if I go to finish no earlier than. So the finish no earlier than didn't give me an error, or a warning, I should say, and it made the change that I wanted. And I have this handy notification. Hey, just reminder, Frank, you have an extra constraint driving the schedule that might not be obvious. But let's look at what happens when I try to change the start date. Let's undo that. So here we are. We're back to where we were. So let's do start date September 1st. So I get a warning from the planning wizard. It says you've moved tooling investment away from test prototype. The tasks are linked. As a result, the link between the two tasks is not driving the start of the later task. So it's saying the change you just made, it's kind of a warning. These tasks are linked. There's a link. This link is no longer driving the schedule. And it's giving you these options. It says you can either move the task and remove the link. You can move the task and keep the link, or you can cancel, which is kind of like don't make any changes. So let's do the first one first. Let's move it and remove the link. Okay, so you can see what happened. It removed the link, so the predecessor is blank and there's no arrow anymore, but it's still floating out here. Why is that? Well, it's because I have this start no earlier than constraint. Microsoft Project still wants to, start tasks. It's still being auto-scheduled by the engine, by the scheduling engine, but instead of using the predecessor as the constraint, now it's using the start no earlier than as the constraint. Okay, that's why it's still out here, but there's no arrow. So the reason this probably isn't a best practice is it breaks that relationship visually. From a scheduling perspective, we still have the same result as we wanted unless we change the schedule. So there are some impacts to doing this. Once we broke this link, if there was a delay, let's just look at that for a minute. If there was a delay in test prototype, let's just make it really late, like October 1st. I'll just move that. You can see it has no impact on this anymore, because what's driving the schedule of tooling investment is the start no earlier than constraint. There's no linkage. So let's undo all this. Okay, so now we have our linkage back. We're where we were before. Let's move the start date again to, let's move it to this August 1st, for example. And let's keep the link this time instead of removing the link. So you can see I still have my task start no earlier than constraint. Okay, but I've also kept my predecessor link. Now the result's the same now, but again, this is better than what we had before. This is more of a best practice. Why? Because if this first one gets delayed, let's move this out to October 1st or whatever. Let's just move it. Don't worry about the error on that. You can see it moved this stuff with it because the linkage is still there. So even though this has a start no earlier than constraint, it was basically overridden by the linkage, because now the linkage became kind of the schedule driver, because this task is so late, it doesn't care anymore that it has a start no earlier than constraint. The linkage, the plan from the linkage is already way past that. So that's why it's really important as you build your schedule to think about what constraints you have on your tasks. Don't just focus on getting the result that you want. Okay, I want this to line up to this month or to this date. Instead of focusing on the results, focus on their relationships and that they make sense, that they're the right relationships. Otherwise, your project plan that works today might not make sense tomorrow. It might be totally broken tomorrow. And you might have to go through and manually start changing everything again, or rebuilding all those relationships to something that makes sense. Okay. So we talked a lot about constraints. Let's just look at the task information advanced window, and let's just look at the other options that are on here. And we won't go through all these examples today, but just be aware that they all kind of work the same. So there's start as late as possible, which we talked about. It will push the task back as late as possible in the schedule. Usually you don't want to do that unless there's a very specific reason, like cash flow. As soon as possible, which is the default. Finish no earlier than, finish no later than, we've talked about. Must finish on and must start on, we'll talk about in the next session. But essentially, these override all constraints. So if for example, I change this to must finish on, and let's say February 1st, 2020. I get a warning, and let's read this warning. You set a must finish on constraint. This could result in a scheduling conflict, either now or later, because the task has at least one other task linked to it. So it's giving you a warning. It's saying you set this must finish on constraint, which is kind of like a hard constraint. It's like a constraint that will override every other constraint in the plan. I personally almost never use these, and I don't recommend using them unless there's a very, very important task that, for example, people would go to jail for if it didn't happen. You know, if there's like a legal document that must be submitted by this date, you know, like a financial reporting or something, and it absolutely must be done, maybe in that situation it makes sense to use this. But I almost never use it because when you use this, it overrides all of the relationships. And Microsoft Project even warns you, be careful, doing this could break your schedule because it will ignore everything. So let's look at this warning. You have three options. You have cancel, which means don't do it, right? It says continue, but avoid the conflict by using a finish no earlier than constraint, which means, you know, do what you want to do, but don't use this constraint. Don't use the must finish no earlier, you know, must finish on date constraint. Use the finish no earlier than constraint instead. Or there's continue, a must finish on constraint will be set. So it's almost like, look, either, you know, don't do this, do it, but, you know, use the other constraint that we just talked about that won't break your project plan, or continue, do this. Okay, now let's look at what happens when I do that. So it totally broke my project plan because now those tasks happen way in the past and everything is broken now. Project can't do anything about it. This is like a hard constraint that I've set that the project file has no control over. And if you look, we actually have a similar but a slightly different icon. So instead of, let me put another constraint on just so you can see the difference. So there's the finish no earlier than constraint, right? And then there's this must finish on or must start on constraint. So must finish on. So the difference is they both have this warning icon, but the must finish on, must start on, they're red. Again, this is really something you want to try to avoid because it totally overrides everything in project. And again, short of something that must be done or people go to jail or something like that, I almost never recommend using those types of constraints. And even Project doesn't recommend using those constraints. It warns you 3 times. So those are the must finish on and must start on constraints. And then there's start no earlier than, start no later than. So start no earlier than, start no later than, they're the same as finish no earlier than, finish no later than, in the sense that they will drive your project schedule only if there's not something else superseding it. Whereas the must finish on, must start on, those are totally hard constraints. Nothing can override them, so it can totally break your project, okay? So those are all the types of constraints that can be applied to tasks. So we actually covered quite a bit. We talked about constraints with predecessors, and we also talked about constraints related to start and finish dates. Okay, so that'll probably conclude today's lesson. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you in the next lesson. So stay with us and have a great day. Thank you. Bye.